Welcome to the next in this series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today we are going to discuss some of the challenges facing the new nation now that the Constitution was in place. Sorry, but there are a lot of terms for you to keep track while you are listening to this lecture, so do the best that you can. Some of these just have just a couple of words here and there that you need to be able to identify. Others are a little bit more complicated, so let's get to it. Few men have dominated their era more than George Washington. With his victory over the British in the American Revolution to his election as the nation's first president, Washington was seen as the embodiment of what made America great. Why? First, Washington was a wealthy Virginia planter who risked everything to fight for his nation's independence. This made him, in many respects, sort of the ultimate version of a patriot. Yet at a time when many Americans might have made him king, Washington shunned power and returned to his life at Mount Vernon following the war. In other words, Washington seemed to be the opposite of a tyrant. This is the big reason why the new Constitution was approved in the first place. Many feared that the new government, especially the powerful office of the presidency, would create new opportunities for tyranny and the oppression of the American people. For many, only the knowledge that George Washington would inevitably be chosen as the nation's first president led them to support and vote for the Constitution. Yet Washington faced numerous problems as the nation's first president. Some of those problems threatened the very future of the new government. One of the first challenges that Washington faced was that of creating a new government. As the first president, Washington had to create the job. While the Constitution outlined the basic powers of the office, it didn't specify how those powers should be exercised. Some of the things were rather trivial. For example, there was a debate over how one should address the president. A king was your Majesty or Your Highness. But what about a president? Ultimately, they settled on the very simple Mr. President, a title we still use today. Another issue was the presidential salary. The government set the initial salary for the president at $25,000 a year, a rather large sum in 1789. Washington initially tried to refuse payment, preferring to be seen as a public servant. He was talked into taking the money, however, to establish a precedent for his successors. Government leaders did not want anyone to think that only the very wealthy could be president. Far more important was Washington's decision to appoint a group of advisors to help him administer the new government. This group became known as the Cabinet. Initially, there were three cabinet positions. Thomas Jefferson was named Secretary of State. Jefferson was one of the wisest men of his day. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he had already served as ambassador to France. In other ways, however, Jefferson was to become a problematic choice for Washington's government. Jefferson was deeply suspicious of the new Constitution. He feared that the government that it created was too powerful, and that it might soon lead to tyranny. The second cabinet position was the Secretary of the Treasury, in other words, the guy who would oversee the nation's money. Washington appointed his friend and former military aide, Alexander Hamilton, to the position. Unlike Jefferson, Hamilton supported an interpretation of the Constitution that promoted a powerful national government. He and Jefferson would soon butt heads on many issues. The third cabinet position was the Secretary of War. Washington named the experienced military commander Henry Knox to the position. Knox, though a capable leader, would soon be nearly forgotten in the struggles that would break out between Hamilton and Jefferson. Presidents today still appoint a cabinet of advisors, so this is another place where Washington set a precedent that we still follow to this day. Of course, today the cabinet has gone from 3 members to 15. Barack Obama has advisors in such diverse offices as defense, interior, education, and energy. Another significant challenge for Washington lay on the frontier west of the Appalachian Mountains. Under the Treaty of Paris that had ended the American Revolution, the territory west of the Appalachians, north of Florida, and south of Canada was given to the new nation. This territory was seen as critical to the future of the United States. One of the major reasons why many Americans had declared war upon the British had to do with the King's decisions to cut off the Ohio River country to American settlement with the Proclamation of 1763. Controlling that territory was another matter, however. The Native American tribes who inhabited this region were furious when they learned of the Treaty of Paris. They believed that they controlled this territory and the British did not have the authority to give it away. The peoples most angry about this were the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Ojibwe, and they promised to resist American expansion. To make matters worse, the British were not keeping to their agreement under the Treaty of Paris. That treaty required them to abandon their forts in the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. They refused to do it, however. This was an insult to the new American government. It also posed a practical problem, as the British used these forts to supply their Native American allies with guns and ammunition, which they then used to fight the Americans. The U.S. needed to respond to both the British and the Native American threat. The initial American policy was simply conquest. George Rogers Clark, a hero of the American Revolution, argued that the U.S. would have to send in the army to subdue the Indians and convince them to submit to American power. As he said, quote, "We shall be eternally involved in a war with some nation or other, until we shall at last, in order to save blood and treasure, be reduced to the necessity of convincing them that we are always able to crush them at pleasure and determined to do it when even they misbehave." Them, in this case, would be the Native American tribes. To accomplish this goal, the U.S. built Fort Washington along the Ohio River. This infuriated the local Indian tribes, who viewed this as their territory. In response, they began to raid American settlements across the Ohio River country. The Indian attack was led by a unified force of Miami and Shawnee warriors. The Miami were led by Little Turtle, and the Shawnee by a leader named Blue Jacket. To answer the Indian attack, Josiah Harmer was given command of almost 1,500 men and told to subdue the Indians. In 1790, he led his force north out of Fort Washington and into present-day Indiana, where they were completely overwhelmed and defeated by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket's warriors. One of his men essentially described the situation this way: "For God's sake, retreat. There are Indians enough to eat you up." End quote. In other words, this was not a proud moment for the American military. The next American to try to defeat the Indians was Arthur St. Clair. Unlike Harmer, St. Clair was a regular military officer. In other words, he was well trained, or at least supposedly he was well trained. He was given command of 2,300 professional soldiers, again, soldiers who also had been well trained. He was also given 8 cannons, so he was well armed as well. Unfortunately for the Americans, he was also overconfident. Little Turtle and Blue Jacket followed St. Clair's advance. Along the Wabash River, they surrounded his force and launched a brutal attack. Oh, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. When the smoke cleared, there were only 500 American survivors. This was the worst defeat the U.S. has ever suffered at the hands of Indians. Now, the Indians responded to this by now making demands upon the U.S. government. Rather than the U.S. making demands upon them, the Indians said, "We want you to abandon all lands north of the Ohio River. Those are our conditions for an end to our raids upon your people." So the Indians are feeling quite bold here. They feel that they have the upper hand. They are the most powerful force in the region. And so they're making demands upon the American government. This was a true crisis for the new nation. Expansion westward had been one of the things that drove the colonies to declare independence in 1776. Failure to secure the western territories might make this land vulnerable to conquest by the British, the French, or even the Spanish. It might even imperil the very existence of the new constitutional government. So the government got really serious. Anthony Wayne, a hero of the American Revolution, was given command of a new force. That force included 3,500 professional soldiers. Moreover, Wayne did not take this force into battle right away. Instead, he continued to train and drill them until he was convinced they were ready. In 1794, he marched his men north from Fort Washington, just as Harmer and St. Clair had done before him. Once again, he was attacked by a strong confederation of allied tribes under the leadership of Little Turtle. The battle was fought near present-day Toledo, Ohio. A tornado had gone through the area a few days before, knocking down trees and tearing up the land. Thus, the battle that was fought was known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Unlike Harmer and St. Clair, however, Wayne was victorious. Little Turtle surrendered. Little Turtle was forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, which recognized the right of the United States to settle what is now southern and eastern Ohio. The ability of Americans to move west was now secured. The threat posed by a British takeover of the area was also lessened by another treaty known as Jay's Treaty. In this treaty, the British agreed to give up their forts in American territory. Again, this strengthened American claims to the region. Another problem arose over the powers of the new government. One of the fundamental disputes that sparked the American Revolution was the claim that the British government did not have the right to tax the colonies. These claims led to charges of tyranny. The new U.S. government, however, soon found that it needed taxes in order to raise the money needed to run the government. One such tax was placed upon whiskey. A whiskey tax hit frontier communities the hardest. Grain that wasn't eaten was typically turned into alcohol. It was a very profitable industry. In western Pennsylvania, a group of farmers decided that the whiskey tax was no different than the tax on tea or stamps that the British government had tried to impose before the Revolution. They refused to pay the tax, claiming that the government had no power to issue it. Worse yet, when the tax collectors showed up in the region, they were attacked. President Washington saw the Whiskey Rebellion as a challenge to the power of the new government. He realized that if the new Constitution were to survive, it had to exert its authority. Thus he asked Congress to create an army of 15,000 men, and he personally led them on a march into the rebellion and the rebellious region. The rebels were routed and the crisis averted. Now, I just want to point this out. Issues like this continue to arrive today. A couple of years ago, a Nevada rancher named Cliven Bundy, for example, refused to pay grazing fees or grazing taxes for the right to graze his cattle on public lands. Once again, the military was sent in to deal with this. It was seen as a challenge to the federal government. So these issues, while we think they're settled, really have not been, at least not among all Americans. Excuse me. A final problem that faced the new government was the growing political divisions, and these divisions that existed within Washington's cabinet itself. The two at the heart of the controversy were Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. These two men had very different visions of America's future. Hamilton proposed policies that would strengthen the nation's business and industry, which he believed were key to a strong economy. He also favored a broad interpretation of the powers of the new national government. In other words, in any dispute between the national government and the states, Hamilton tended to side with the national government. In contrast, Thomas Jefferson argued that the nation's strength lay in agriculture. Farmers, he argued, were independent. They grew their own food and they needed no one else to survive. Thus he favored policies that made land cheap and affordable to anyone who wanted to farm. He also feared the power of the new government. Typically, he sided with the states, believing they were better at defending the liberty of the people. Initially, Washington tried to stay out of these disputes. He believed that political divisions were a threat to the future of the new government. Instead, Americans should focus on what they shared in common, rather than what divided them. In time, however, Washington came to side with Hamilton's vision. Washington favored a powerful national government. And we can see this in his reaction to the Whiskey Rebellion, where he sends in the army to put down a rebellion against national power. Moreover, the divisions between Hamilton and Jefferson eventually led to the creation of the nation's first political parties. Those parties were the Federalists, who were led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, who were led by Jefferson. In conclusion, it's interesting to look at the years just after the ratification of the new Constitution. The problems faced by the new government and the solutions reached by that government continue to affect us today. Moreover, issues like westward movement and national power would ultimately lead directly to the Civil War. That's all we have for this lecture. Please go back and listen to parts again if you have questions, or come see me, send me an email, or talk to me in class. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in class soon.